The ICFRC hosts community programs to address topics of international interest. We thank our members, our volunteers, and our interns for making these forums possible since 1983, which was the year that Margaret Thatcher was elected for her second term in office. I want to acknowledge our university and community sponsors, the University of Iowa's international programs, the University of Iowa's honors program, the University of Iowa Center for Public Policy, and the Stanley U of I Foundation Support Organization for their financial support. And I thank today's special sponsors, Mike Margolin, Midwest One, and Dave, Denise, and Mike Tiffany. They're often here, but I don't see them here today. I also thank City Channel 4 for professionally recording our programs for cablecast on City Channel 4 or 118-2, and the U of I Library's digital archives. Over 200 ICFRC programs are now podcasts and can be found on iTunes, so I encourage you to look for those too.
So today it's my great pleasure to introduce Joelle Adda. Joelle is a administrative law judge in France. She's currently working part-time at the National Court of Asylum in France and is also a visiting professor at the University of Iowa College of Law, where she's teaching a course about European Union law. So we're very happy to have her here to help our students understand that complex topic. Until 2017, she was president of the Administrative Court of Lille, and prior to joining this administrative court, she was president of the Fifth Chamber of the Administrative Court of Appeal in Paris, so she has a lot of experience in the administrative courts. She graduated from the University of Paris and from the French National School of Administration, the ENA. She was rapporteur and subsequently commissaire de gouvernement, these are both judicial positions, in proceedings before the Versailles Administrative Tribunal, and then rapporteur before the Court of Auditors, rapporteur and subsequently commissaire de gouvernement in proceedings before the Paris Administrative Court of Appeal, a national expert to the European Commission at the Legal Service, a legal director of ARCEP, which is the, I think she was explained to me as the French FCC, French Telecommunications and Post Regulator, and before that, associate presiding judge of, associate presiding judge of Second Chamber at the Administrative Court of Paris. And also, she was a legal director at the Société de Grand Paris, which is a big company that, a public company that provides for the transportation around Paris, at the periphery of Paris, you might say. So we're really pleased to have her teaching our students here, and I'm pleased to welcome her to the podium.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I would like to thank the Iowa City Council of Foreign Relations for inviting me to speak today about the new challenges facing the European Union. I am aware that an American audience might expect me to broach the issues of the current trade war between the United States and the European Union, or the organization of the Brexit under orderly and satisfactory conditions. But I will focus on the migration crisis and terrorism because they are the main concerns currently facing the European Union, according to opinion surveys of European citizens. The migration crisis has greatly changed the political landscape of the European Union. It was clear in the recent elections, which showed a weakening of the traditional center-left and center-right parties and a rise in power of many either far-left or extreme right-wing parties, generally called populist. The vote for these populist parties is often associated with a rejection of the European Union. In fact, the link between the two questions is somewhat more complex than the recent polls, as the recent polls show. Among the other factors shaping European Union opinion over the last 2 years are the consequences of the Brexit vote in June 2016 and the election of President Trump in November 2016 too. Just after these two significant events, many commentators announced that it was the beginning of the unraveling of the European Union under the pressure of nationalism and populist parties. Then there was the election of the center-left President Macron in France in May 2017. Many experts then thought that the populist wave was stopped. It's true that opinion polls in Europe now show that European citizens are more supportive of European Union than they were in recent years. In the most recent standard Eurobarometer, it's polling. It measures the European opinion twice a year. So the last published was published in spring, showed the situation in spring 2018. The index of optimism for the future of the European Union reached 58%, the highest level since 2011. And the total of pessimists reached a low of 36%. And especially since the deadlock over the Brexit negotiation and the terrible situation in the United Kingdom, which is now considering a no-deal Brexit, there is no great movement of opinion on the continent that is considering or even advocating leave the EU. But, and this is extremely important, all recent votes in Europe show that European citizens also have more sympathy for populist parties, which are often nationalistic, and this may later have repercussions on the European Union. So the commentators who thought that the populist wave was being stopped were wrong. How can we explain this situation, and what is the link with immigration? To understand, we need to refer to the facts. The last standard Eurobarometer, I quote again it, gives us some clues about the main concern facing the European Union for the moment. At the question, what do you think are the two most, so there were two most important issues facing the EU at the moment, here are the answers. Immigration is still seen as the most important issue facing the EU, cited by 38% of respondents, after peaking in autumn 2015 at 58%. With 28%, terrorism is a second concern, but it was 9% more in autumn 2017. This decrease reflects the fact that there were fewer terrorist attacks in 2017 than in 2015 and 2016, although the level of threat stays high. To understand why this concern is so high, I will focus on the immigration issue and especially on what was called the refugee crisis, which really broke out in 2015, even though there were already some forerunners. To clarify, when we speak about immigration as a major concern in the European Union, we mean non-European immigration. In a survey conducted at the same time, spring 2018, 82% of respondents supported the free movement of European Union citizens with the right to live, work, study, and do business across the European Union for European citizens, which means that European immigration is very welcome. I don't speak about the UK. But nearly 4 in 10 Europeans think that immigration from outside the EU is more a problem than an opportunity. That's why I will focus on the recent non-immigration migratory flows, because it is this immigration which is the main concern at European level. My goal here is to understand what happened rather than judge. Before addressing more directly the question of the recent massive influx of asylum seekers in Europe, it may be useful to recall some definitions. By definition, an international immigrant is a person who is living in a country other than his or her country of birth and nationality for more than 1 year. It's the definition under UN Population Agency. An asylum seeker is someone who has applied or intends to apply to become a refugee, which means to get international protection granted by the Geneva Convention relating to the status of refugee, or any other international protection. And a refugee is someone who falls within the definition of a refugee, within the meaning of this Geneva Convention, which I will briefly describe. Therefore, this status, refugee status, should be granted after his or her case has been reviewed by a refugee protection agency, usually under the control of a court. In addition to asylum seekers, there are also many other categories of migrants. The other category of migrants in a legal situation may include foreign students, foreigners who are allowed to work, and all those who have the right to settle in the host country because of their family ties or for humanitarian reasons. It is in addition to the traditional flows of legal immigrants that Europe has been able to absorb for decades without difficulties, that the wars in the Middle East following the so-called Arab Spring in 2011 resulted in a significant increase of the flow of asylum seekers. What was exactly the evolution of the flow? This slide shows the trend for asylum application from 2006 to 2017. It shows that the number of what we call first-time, the blue one, is the first-time applicants, because you have the right to apply many times, but what is the reference is the first-time applicants, was multiplied by 7 between 2008 and 2015 to reach a peak at 1.3 million in 2015. This may be partly explained by the fact that this year, 2015, was that of the great exodus of Syrians at the height of the war in Syria. But also, in the late summer of 2015, the government led by Mrs. Merkel in Germany, of course, decided to allow almost 1 million refugees into Germany. This statement had a magnet effect for migrants that continued in 2016 and 2017, and I will show that they are not exactly the same migrant. However, even though the flow of asylum seekers, as you can see, dropped significantly since 2016 as a result of various measures taken by the European Union, it remains much higher than before 2014. Last year, in 2017, 650,000 first-time asylum seekers applied for international protection in the member states of the European Union. This is still 3 times higher than the normal situation before the Arab Spring. So what happens to these asylum seekers? We have to examine, to understand, we have to examine the relevant EU law and process. Some obtains international protection after having their case examined, and some do not. By international protection, we mean those who have been recognized as refugees under the Geneva Convention related to the status of refugee adopted in 1951 under the auspices of the United Nations and extended in 1967. And those who have obtained the so-called subsidiary protection, the later concept being specific to European Union law. So the definition of a refugee under the Geneva Convention, you can see it here. It's a refugee is a person who has a well-founded fear of risk being persecuted for reason of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion in his or her country of origin. Well-founded fear means that it must have objective basis. But the feared persecution must not necessarily emanate from state agents. It is enough that it's tolerated by the state authorities to get the status, the refugee status. Of course, as in any definition, every word counts. And the whole definition leaves a large margin of appreciation, as you can see, a large margin of appreciation for each country, agency, or judge to interpret these words, which define the criteria allowing a migrant to be protected as a refugee. The elasticity of the definition of persecution depends upon the political will of state parties implementing the convention. Moreover, the interpretation of this word, especially the vague notion of social group, what does it mean, you know, is certainly more generous in European Union than in many other countries. For instance, for example, in France, we recognize as social group within the meaning of the convention homosexuals coming from countries in which homosexuality is deeply repressed. In some cases, women trying to escape forced marriage are considered as a social group. Young women risking female genital mutilation in countries in which this is a normal custom. And women victims of sex trafficking forced into prostitution and agreeing to leave the prostitution network. I can answer a question about that. Obviously, not all the countries having signed the Geneva Convention, some of them being those fled by these victims, by the victim we receive, have such a broad interpretation of those provisions. And the definition of people who can be granted the subsidiary protection under European Union law is the following. It's a directive, which means some European Union law, which says a person eligible for subsidiary protection status means a third country national or stateless who would face a real risk of suffering serious harm if he or she returned to the country of origin, and serious harm is defined as the risk of death penalty or execution, torture or inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment of an applicant in the country of origin, or serious and individual threat to a civilian life or person by reason of indiscriminate violence in situation of international or internal armed conflicts. So as you can see, it's much broader than the first one. And so I can answer some questions if there are about this. So many people who would not get the refugee status under the Geneva Convention may obtain this protection, which scope is broader. And the people who obtain any of this status may stay legally in the host country and have a right to family reunification. But this can happen only after a long and costly process. This process is a little complex. So during this process, under European Union law, which sets out what is called minimum standards and procedures for processing and deciding asylum application, the asylum seekers are also granted an interpreter and have access to legal aid, which means a free lawyer in most cases, if they can't afford a lawyer, which is, of course, generally the case. The member states must also provide specific legal assistance, and this is under European Union law, and organizations that might be able to help or inform them concerning the available reception condition, including health care. This means that many NGOs are subsidized by the taxpayers in order to help and inform the flux of asylum seekers. And many social workers must also be involved in this task. The member state must also, under European Union law, provide an adequate standard of living for applicants which guarantees their subsistence and protects their physical and mental health. So you see, these people, the people have to first join, reach Europe, register as an applicant, wait, and I will give more details about what happened during this step. And then there is a decision on their application. Either the application is approved, no problem, in this case they get the legal protection, or the application is rejected. In this case they can appeal, they go before my court, the court in which I work, and there is a new decision which maybe they can get the legal protection, or they can be rejected again. So if they are rejected, they are supposed to return to home or other country, but in fact many of them stay with undocumented, but stay in the host country. And about the wait step, you know, it's the time during which a case is processed is generally quite long, generally between 1 or 2 years, since almost any asylum seekers who are denied by the relevant agencies of refugee status appeals before the relevant court. Almost all of them appeal. This time has a psychological cost for the asylum seekers. It's certainly very unpleasant to have had a long and painful journey and to wait at least 1 year to know if you are recognized as a refugee. But it has also a significant cost for the country, which has to manage the process. Although food and medical care is provided, the housing issue is sometimes a big problem when the state does not have enough premises to accommodate a very large number of people, and especially when it multiplies by 7, you know. So in this case, an allowance for housing is given to the asylum seekers. But it's certainly not enough to pay a hotel or a rent, or to rent an apartment in a city like Paris or Nantes or Lille. I mean, I just quote some where almost, where even most nationals can't afford to live, and there are already a lot of homelesses. So this may lead with the situation you see. This is Paris. This is Paris. A photo taken in Paris, Porte de la Chapelle, a few months ago. This helps to explain why there is so much conflict between the European Union member states on sharing the burden of examining the asylum seekers. Let's now focus on the number of asylum seekers who have obtained positive decision on asylum application in 2016. The positive decision in the EU, I will not repeat the figures you see. It was, if you just report per capita, I mean per million inhabitants, it was almost 1,400. In the fiscal year, corresponding fiscal year in the US, it was 261 per million inhabitants, which means that the proportion of asylum applications satisfied in Europe per capita was therefore 5.5 times higher than in the United States, 3 times as much as the United States, Canada, plus Australia combined. But these are only the requests satisfied, and most of the people whose applications were rejected also remain in the host country. It's also interesting to have a look on the countries of origin of the asylum seekers and their evolution. The first time, this was in 2015, I mean at the peak. As you can see, and this is really not surprising, most of them came either from Syria, from Afghanistan, and from Iraq. But you can see that there is also a significant proportion coming from Albania, which is a safe country, and even a candidate to the European Union. And a third of the people from Albania, which is also a very small country, apply to be asylum seeker in the rest of the EU. Okay, so this was the situation in 2015. Let's have a look on the situation. Sorry, on the situation. Excuse me. This was 2015, and this is 2017. As you can see, even if Syrians still count for, so it was clear that in 2015, ISIS then imposed in the Middle East, especially in Syria and Iraq, a regime of terror in large part of the territory. Now, we are in 2017, there are still Syrians still count for almost 13% of the asylum seekers, Iraqi and Afghan for 7%, sorry, but most of the asylum seekers come from other countries, and especially sub-Saharan African countries. And some even come from countries like Bangladesh or Ivory Coast that are not considered as particularly dangerous, or even from countries so like Albania, I already mentioned. So some of these data show that the right of asylum is frequently used to circumvent the absence of or the insufficiency of the legal possibility of economic immigration. Are these facts sufficient to explain why immigration has been considered the main concern of the public opinion of the European Union in the last 2 years? Does this concern mean that most Europeans are xenophobic? I don't think so. Apart from many other clues that show that there is not a majority of xenophobic feeling in Europe, including a high proportion of intermarriage between people from the host country and people of other nationalities, and also many interracial marriage. A recent poll conducted in spring 2018 of the Pew Research Center shows that a majority of Europeans favor taking in refugees. As you can see, the proportion of population that is ready to receive refugees in the European countries surveyed is much higher than in the United States. You see, the United States, 66%, and not only almost all countries are above, but the EU median is 77%, an overwhelming 77%. And among the exceptions, there is especially Italy, Poland, and Hungary. And about Italy, it must be taken into account that as a peripheral country, it is at the front line of European migration crisis. So how could we explain why, even though a large majority of European citizens usually welcome refugees, but see the question, how it was called, refugees from countries where people are fleeing violence and war, to use the term of the Pew Research Center survey, almost all the recent elections in the European Union countries have shown the rise of some anti-immigration parties, or at least parties which are reluctant towards certain category of immigrants. Look at almost every elections in Europe in last year. The federal election in 2017, September 2017 in Germany, in which there is a rise of AfD, which is the extreme right anti-immigration party. The election on October 2017 in Austria, and the Czech legislative election in October 2017 reflect a significant increase in the number of party votes critical of the open door policy recommended by Merkel in 2015, which resulted in an increase in the migration wave. And after the last election held in Italy in March of this year, Matteo Salvini, the leader of the rightist league, who is generally qualified as nativist, has emerged as a strong man in the new government. And even in Sweden, which was one of the most hospitable countries for immigrant, the recent election in September, just last month, showed a significant rise of a conservative and right-wing populist party which believes that Swedish immigration has been too important in recent years and has seriously threatened national identity and social cohesion. What is the explanation of such reaction of European citizens who, as the survey showed, are not in principle opposed to immigration and are open to take into account the suffering refugees? We can use some clues to propose some hypotheses. An explanation is the question of public security, especially for women, because of massive arrival of young men coming from male-dominated culture which ignore freedom for women. A second factor is the fear of losing the identity of host countries, which means the fear that some migrants, when they come from a totally different culture, refuse to integrate into the host country. Thirdly, even if the applicants to whom international protection has been refused by the public and by the court after appeal, even if they are, as I mentioned, theoretically obliged to leave Europe, is voluntarily or by deportation, in fact, 70% of them remain in Europe without authorization. So I will discuss successively these different concerns. First, the question of public security, especially for women, but also related to terrorism, but there are two totally different issues, of course. The main symbol of this concern is what happened in Germany during the New Year's Eve celebration of 2016, mainly in the Cologne city center, but also in Hamburg, Dortmund, Düsseldorf, Stuttgart. For all Germany, during this very night, there were 24 rapes, 1,200 women were sexually assaulted, and according to the police, among the identified suspects, half were asylum seekers. Almost all of them were non-German, I mean, even the people who are not asylum seekers. And some imams have claimed that the women were responsible for the incident because of their clothing. The scale of the attacks was certainly a trauma for the German public, and it sparked an international outcry. In addition, the fact that for almost 5 days, the New Year's attacks were not reported by the majority of the major German media has given the impression that the media wanted to conceal the dangerousness of some of these recent immigrants. So that's a demonstration of women. So why is this? And according to the Financial Times, quoting Mr. de Maizière, then Mr. Interior, there were in Germany, there was in 2016 a 6.7% increase in crime of violence, cases of murder and manslaughter increased 14%, of rape and sexual assault by 13%, and grievous bodily harm by 10%. Regarding violence against women, or more generally the increase in the number of violent attacks after the wave of asylum seekers, sociologists point out, and they are right, that in general, violent attacks are committed by young men, whatever their origin. So it's not irrelevant to show the proportion of young men among asylum seekers, so which are the proportion is 68%, and much more significant among the people under the age of 34. The issue of terrorism that I have been, as I mentioned, that has been the second concern of the European citizen after immigration must certainly be totally disconnected from the recent wave of massive immigration. It's linked to many other geopolitical issues. But the fact that jihadist terrorism has increased significantly in parallel with the waves of immigrants from the Middle East has made it possible to establish a link between the two phenomena in people's minds, even if this link is unfounded. You see that, especially in France, we had many terrible attacks in 2015 and in 2016, especially in Paris and in Lille. and in Nice, sorry, excuse me. I must add that after the terrorist attack identified in this table, because I did not find a table which was totally up to date, there was several other jihadist attacks, most of which caused only a few losses, which may explain why the American press no longer talk about it. The more recent being in August 31 this year, when an Afghan teenager stabbed and injured 2 Americans in Amsterdam Central Station, and the other 2 weeks ago, a bloody hostage-taking at the Cologne train station. The man has been identified as a Syrian refugee who came to Germany in early 2015 and was granted asylum. So even if the terrorist threat remains high and constantly evolving, it has clearly decreased. Therefore, the second factor, which is the fear that uncontrolled immigration contribute to the dilution of the identity of their country, is probably even more important than the explanation based on security. The next slide will show how widespread this feeling is. So the Pew Research Center conducted a survey to highlight diverging views, that was the idea, on the effect of immigration to the German coalition parties after the tension between the Christian Democrat Union, CDU, the Merkel's party, which is open to immigration, and its ally, CSU, the Bavarian ally, but who is opposed to the immigration of Mrs. Merkel, which open to immigration. But what is interesting, in fact, is the poll is not so much the differences between, the point, but the commonalities in the response. The commonality between the responses of both parties about a concern shared by many European citizens who otherwise welcome refugees. As you see, whatever is the party, there are very few people who take the nationalist view of immigrants are a burden on our economy because they take our job. Of course, there is a difference between the two parties, but it's not very, very strong. What is significant is the overwhelming majority who think of people who think that it is necessary for immigrants to adopt our custom and tradition. You see, almost 80%, whatever is the party. Rather than economics, the shock is deeply cultural between the old European cultures, deeply rooted in liberalism, democracy, freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, and the rejection of all discrimination based on sex, race, ethnic, and social origin. These are our values in Europe. And the culture of some recent immigrants who have imported or do not want to give up a patriarchist culture and sometimes want to import a religious law against secular tradition of the host countries. This democratic and liberal culture, our European values, can be firmly defended by people of foreign origin, of course, who have left their country precisely because they have chosen European values and are deeply concerned about the behavior of some people from their own country of origin who wish to impose it in their host countries. Is this cultural fear justified? I must clarify what I mean by cultural. The problem does not come from the importation of innocent custom, culinary habits, music, theater, cinema of the country of origin, of course, which are generally very welcome by the inhabitant of the host country. The problem is cases of polygamy, female genital mutilation, inequality of succession between men and women, repudiation, forced marriage, honor killing, the right of the husband to beat his wife, which constitute for all those who practice them their cultural values that some, not all, but some want to import in the host country. This is especially the case in some areas, such as some suburbs in France, that we call zones de non-droit in French, lawless areas, And I use the French term because the concept of Nogo Zone, which is sometimes used by the US press, I think that it seems to me exaggerated because it supposes that you cannot go to this zone. And the problem is the fact that in these zones, the inhabitants, whatever is their origin, cannot rely on police and justice to defend themselves against wrongdoer or people who want to impose their own law. This situation, described by many authors, testimonies of school teachers, social workers, has also been mentioned by the French Minister of Interior, a member of the Socialist Party who supported the current President Macron, but decided in October, just this month, to resign, and said in his departure speech that in many suburbs in which immigrants are the majority, the situation, I quote him, the situation is terrible and deteriorated because it is now the law of the strongest that is imposed and that of narco traffickers and radical Islamists who has taken the place of the Republic. Another interesting clue is the survey made by the liberal think tank. I'm sorry, I made a mistake. So I think that I have no slide on it. Made by the liberal think tank, the Institute Montaigne in France, that showed that a significant minority of French Muslims favored Islamic tradition over French law. And for example, 28% said Sharia, the Islamic legal and moral code, should prevail over French national law. So my conclusion is that it's not only exaggerated, but counterproductive from the liberal point of view to polarize the political landscape by opposing nationalists to progressives, or to sanctify or demonize migrants, as many do on both sides. There are all people, very good and very bad, as in any other population. It would be dangerous for the forthcoming European Parliament elections in May 2019, next year, which will play a central role in the future of the European Union for at least the next 5 years, to focus solely on the issue of immigration. There is a real popular demand for more order and authority, and it's impossible to deny the fear of losing one's cultural identity. Since it's likely that the wave of asylum seekers remain important because of demographic reasons and of the geopolitical instability of Europe's geographical environment in Africa, in Middle East, it's essential that the European countries give themselves the means to integrate refugees who are destined to remain in our soil, and to remove those who do not fulfill the condition to be protected, especially if they threaten the security of inhabitants of the host country, whatever their origin. It's certainly necessary for political parties to hear this fear and to take it into account. This certainly does not mean abandoning the rule of law and all legal protections that decades of liberalism have erected in Europe. On the contrary, avoiding polarization and hasty condemnation is probably the best way to protect and reconcile liberalism and democracy in Europe as elsewhere. Thank you for your attention.
Let me start with a question about France. One of the questioners wants to know a little more about your role with the French FCC. And specifically, the question is, how would you compare French and U.S. radio and TV programming? And to what degree is this a result of French regulation?
So, sorry, this is a very interesting question, but in fact, the comparison between RCEP and FCC is not exactly, it does not overlap totally. We have, in fact, the role of the FCC is divided between two agencies in France. The RCEP, which is in in charge of what we call the tube. I mean, the competition about the infrastructure, especially the broadband and the frequencies, and so to organize the market in order to organize competition. And there is another agency which is called the Conseil supérieur de l'audiovisuel, which is in charge of what you mentioned. I mean, the content, and especially, and also there are these rules. I'm really not especially competent to explain, and and also I don't spend a lot of time watching the TV in France. I think that it's maybe still a little better than in United States. I hope that you are not going to resent me to say that. Although you have certainly very good TVs too, but in fact, I must confess that I do not share the very cultural nationalism of France among wanting that most of the program has a French origin, or not most, but a certain proportion of the program has French origin. So, but this is the job of the other of the other agency. My job was really organizing competition, and in fact, I mean, my job, I was just the legal director, but this agency succeeded very well, because when I compare the price for the subscription for either for cell phone or for landline phone in the US and in France, I think that we are much cheaper in France. The prices are much lower in France because there is a better competition. But this is another.
A question about Europe more generally. You talked about the concern about loss of culture and tradition in France and Germany, and you also mentioned Sweden. What about the rest of Europe? Is there a similar?
No, I just mentioned these cases, but yes, the situation is even much more sensitive in many other countries. I mentioned those one plus Italy because they were the countries which received the highest proportion. There is also a divide between the western part of Europe and the eastern part of Europe. But I did not want to broach this issue because it's much more complicated. It's true that there are the countries which are called the Visegrad country, especially Hungary and Poland, who are much more, I mean, as you saw in the polling I showed, Hungary is much more reluctant to accept any kind of migrant, and it's not they are not welcoming as most of the Western countries. Are welcoming the refugees if they are real refugees who are victims. I mean, so in Hungary and Poland, they are much more reluctant, partly, but if I am a judge, so I always hear the two parties, you know, and they say, especially for instance, the Polish Prime Minister. I read recently an interview by her. She said, "We are not at all reluctant to welcome refugees. We had welcomed 1 million refugees from Ukraine because they were not so different from us." And Hungary has also received, because it was also at the border. So there, I mean, not at the border totally at the beginning, but because there are also other countries like Bulgaria and Romania, but they have other serious issues about. That's why, especially Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, described himself, his regime as illiberal democracy. But this would be really another talk. And because there are some breach of the rule of law, some serious breach of the rule of law in especially Hungary and also Poland. But this is really would need another talk.
Well, we'll have to get you back for more. One of the questioners wants to ask a question about religious convictions and notes that religious convictions do sometimes conflict with national law, even here in our country. And so it's not surprising that some people hold religious beliefs above national law. The question is, what can and what maybe are European governments doing to try to broker a solution that moves toward more respect for religious convictions while still maintaining peace and order?
I think that the problem is not religious conviction, at least clearly in the western part of Europe and in most countries of Europe. The problem is not religious conviction. The problem is proselytism and imposing law which is contrary to the law. And I mentioned, I will just try to give you some example as an asylum judge. You know, we have perfect victim. I would like to honor, for instance, Nadia Murad, Yazidi woman, raped many times by ISIS warrior in the Middle East, and who became the Nobel Prize this year. I mean, the Peace Nobel Prize that she shared with another wonderful guy, but who takes care of the health of women in Africa. Anyway, so she was a perfect victim, okay? And we have, of course, thousands and hundreds of thousands of real victims as her. But under the sorry, it does not. The subsidiary protection, when you have people who flee a war, a situation of war, and we give them protection under the subsidiary protection, we can have people who flee Syria, but it's not because you flee Syria that you are a victim. Who flees Syria? There are also persecutors from who precisely may have raped her and tortured her and many other, because you can have fled Syria because you were either an ISIS warrior or someone who supported Assad or whatever, or Al-Qaeda or whoever. So it's not enough to say, I come from Syria, to say, I am a victim. You know, it's really, this is a very big issue. And so we have sometimes some people to whom we granted either the status, the refugee status, or the subsidiary convention, subsidiary protection, and who happen to be wrongdoers and who happen to want to impose their law. There are some situations sometimes which are really terrible. I will give another example about feminine mutilation, I mean genital mutilation. You can have sometimes, let's say, a mother with a very young girl who says, I fled my family, I fled because they wanted to make a excision or whatever, the different feminine mutilation. Okay, so we grant them asylum. They are in France. Okay, we think she's protected. And what may happen? Another part of the family come in France, and in fact, in France, it's done. This is terrible to think that in my country, it's done. You know, it's terrible to know that in Guinea, there are 97% of women, of young women to which it arrives. But it's in Guinea. Sorry, it's, you know, I am not responsible. you understand? And I feel responsible. If I am wrong in my when I judge, if I am wrong, okay. If I am wrong because the guy was just, in fact, an economic migrant and he did not deserve the refugee status, and I give her, okay, I'm wrong, but it's not terrible, you know. I am wrong legally, but it's not terrible from an ethical point of view. But if I give this status to someone who is a persecutor, in this case, I feel much more uncomfortable. And of course, I feel also very uncomfortable if I bring back to his country someone who risks to be persecuted in his country. That's why I think that, of course, it costs a lot. All the process I described costs a lot, but it's justified to take the necessary time by the agencies, by judges, with the help of interpreter, of translator. We have interpreter of 220 languages in my court. Yes, because it's written in the European Union law from a language they understand. And there are much more languages than there are countries, especially in Africa or in many countries. So with all these people and the social workers and the NGOs and all these, so it costs a lot. And this may contribute to explain that taxpayers sometimes are a little angry.
Well, we have just time for maybe one more question, and I received several that I think wanted to turn the topic into about us. This is very typical of we Americans. We do tend to make the conversation about us. So some of the questioners are trying to understand the international legal position of the migrant caravan that's coming our way and the big controversy this is arising. And I don't expect that you know, I certainly don't know all the details there, but could you remind us of what the legal status requirement is under the Geneva Convention for someone seeking asylum status? Just what is the standard, legal standard?
No, but the problem is that, theoretically, as soon as the person put one foot in the host country, you are supposed to make the process. Your process is not necessarily exactly the same than ours. I know that it's not exactly the same, but you have also, you are a country complying with the rule of law, with the due process. And so you have some due process. It's not exactly the same, but as far as I understand, you have no free legal aid, for instance, but you have some process. Precisely, I mentioned that one of the reasons why there was a decrease in the number was some decision taken by the European Union. I did not go to the detail, but one of the problem is that since in the European Union we can't, for many reasons, European Convention of Human Rights and so on, we can't send back people who, even if they were, if they did not deserve the refugee status or the subsidiary convention, we can't send them back to their country. But they are supposed to leave, but we invite them to go to a country who would like to welcome them. Generally, there are not so many who say, "Oh, I want." So, but I think that really it's difficult to compare. So I understand that there is this reaction to create any kind of wall, but and in the European Union, our wall are not wall, but so we have the Mediterranean and sea, which became a cemetery, although we have also Frontex, which is the agency of the European Union, who had saved many thousands of lives of people who were about, because I have to say, and I guess that it's not the same situation for you, but we have human trafficking. The problem is human trafficking. Most of my clients, sorry for the expression, the people I see, the asylum seekers I see in my court, tell me I have paid, it's between, according to many rules, between 3,000 and a half euros and 10 to 12,000 euros to come to Europe, that they pay the traffickers. And the traffickers tell them, you will be very happy in Europe, there will not be any... And especially these poor women from Nigeria, and I say women, but sometimes, very often, they are girls, from Nigeria, they tell them, oh, we have found a job for you as a babysitter or hairdresser or whatever. And they come, they think that they... and then they are in the network of prostitution. And so we have this. I don't think that this is the case for your... So really, I can't compare, sorry.
Well, I think we could talk a lot more about that, which is very interesting. So unfortunately, now we have to conclude our program, and I do want to give a big thank you to Joelle Adda for her presentation. I also thank our sponsors, the University of Iowa's International Program, the University of Iowa's Honors Program, the University of Iowa Public Policy Center, the Stanley U of I Foundation Support Organization for their generous support. And we also thank today's special sponsors, Mike Margolin, Midwest One, and Dave, Denise, and Mike Tiffany. And we thank City Channel 4 for making our programs available to viewing audiences. And Joelle, as a small token of our appreciation, I'm very pleased to give you the coveted Iowa City Foreign Relations Council mug. So thank you. Thank you so much. And we are adjourned.